Step aside. We don't serve walk-ins like you." The sentence cut through the warm evening air just as the glass doors reflected Naomi Carter's still figure, her hand resting lightly on the handle as the soft hum of conversation inside slowed, then shifted, a few heads turning, then more, until the entire entryway felt like it was holding its breath. Naomi didn't move right away, didn't frown, didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there in her charcoal coat and low heels, the faint scent of roasted garlic and butter drifting out each time. The door opened for someone else. Someone waved through without question. The hostess, Emily Whitmore, stood poised behind her podium, tablet in hand, posture perfect, smile rehearsed. But her eyes had already made their decision, scanning Naomi once, then dismissing her just as quickly. "Reservation?" Emily asked, tone polite but thin, already certain of the answer she expected. "Carter," Naomi replied, calm, steady, her voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby tables where glasses caught the chandelier light and flickered like quiet witnesses. Emily tapped her screen, slow, deliberate, then shook her head, the corner of her mouth tightening, as if confirming something she had already decided. "I'm not seeing that name," she said, stepping slightly forward, subtly blocking the entrance. As another couple approached behind Naomi and was immediately greeted with a warmer tone, a brighter smile, ushered inside without delay. Naomi noticed, of course she did. The difference wasn't loud, but it was precise, measured in seconds, in eye contact, in the way a door either opened or didn't. She shifted her weight slightly, the polished stone beneath her heels cool and unyielding, and asked, not confrontational, just clear, "Could you check again?" Emily's expression didn't change, but something in her posture hardened, a quiet impatience settling in as she glanced past Naomi toward the waiting line, calculating, prioritizing. "Like I said, we're fully booked," she replied, voice lowering just enough to signal finality. As if the conversation had already ended, a murmur rippled through the nearby tables, subtle but present, forks. Pausing midair, a glass set down a little too carefully, someone whispering behind a hand. Naomi let the silence sit for a second longer than expected, her gaze drifting past Emily into the dining room, taking in the symmetry, the lighting, the way every table was positioned to feel important, every guest meant to feel seen. Then she looked back at Emily, not with anger, not with embarrassment, but with something quieter, something steadier. "Is this how you treat all your guests?" she asked. The question lingered, not sharp, but undeniable, and for a brief moment, the practiced rhythm of the room faltered. Emily let out a small breath, almost a laugh, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and straightened her shoulders, doubling down on certainty. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," she said, gesturing toward the sidewalk as if guiding traffic, efficient, controlled. Inside, a manager glanced toward the entrance, sensing the shift, beginning to move in that direction, while somewhere near the bar, a phone lifted just slightly, the glow of its screen catching the edge of the moment. Naomi didn't step aside, not yet. She simply stood there, the city lights behind her stretching down the block, the reflection in the glass showing both versions of the scene at once, inside and out, who was welcomed and who was not, and in that thin space between them, something unspoken was about to surface. The manager's shoes clicked softly against the marble as he approached, the sound measured, controlled, but just fast enough to suggest urgency beneath the calm. Daniel Brooks adjusted his cuff as he stepped beside Emily, offering Naomi a practiced smile that had smoothed over countless situations before this one. "Good evening. Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone even, almost warm, but his eyes flicked briefly to Emily first, reading her version of the story before giving Naomi the space to speak. Naomi turned slightly toward him, her posture unchanged, shoulders relaxed, hands still at her sides. "I believe there may be a misunderstanding," she said, her voice steady, the kind that did not compete for attention but somehow held it anyway. Daniel nodded once, the gesture small but deliberate, already leaning into resolution. "We do our best to accommodate reservations, but tonight we are at full capacity," he replied, the words smooth, rehearsed, the kind that closed doors without sounding like they did. Behind him, the dining room continued in a quieter rhythm now, Conversations softened, glances lingering a second longer than they should. A server pausing near the wine station just long enough to listen without appearing to. Naomi glanced past Daniel again, her eyes moving across the room not like a guest searching for a table, but like someone measuring something deeper, something structural, the spacing between tables, the flow of movement, the way the staff interacted with certain guests versus others. I understand busy nights, she said, returning her attention to him, but I also understand systems. And systems do not forget names unless something else is guiding the decision. The sentence landed gently, but it carried weight, enough that Daniel's smile tightened at the edges, almost imperceptibly. Emily shifted beside him, her fingers tightening around the tablet. Sir, I already checked. There is nothing under that name. She added quickly, reinforcing the narrative, her tone sharper now, less polished, more certain. Daniel gave a small nod, aligning himself with her, the choice subtle but clear. Then I am afraid we cannot seat you this evening, he said, his voice lowering just enough to signal finality again, the same controlled boundary, the same invisible line. A couple near the entrance hesitated before stepping around Naomi, guided inside with a quick apology and a brighter tone from Emily, the contrast precise, almost clinical. Naomi watched it happen, not reacting outwardly, but something in her gaze sharpened, not with anger, but with recognition, as if a pattern had just confirmed itself. She took a slow breath, the cool night air mixing with the warmth spilling from inside. And for a brief moment, she closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in calculation, the kind that happens when a decision is being made beneath the surface. When she opened them again, the room felt different, not because anything had visibly changed, but because something unseen had shifted direction. I see, she said quietly, her voice softer now, but clearer than before, and she reached into her coat, her movement unhurried, deliberate, drawing just enough attention to the action without forcing it. Daniel's gaze followed instinctively, his posture straightening a fraction, while Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, trying to anticipate what came next. The small black card appeared between Naomi's fingers. Simple, unadorned except for a subtle embossed edge that caught the light for a fraction of a second, and she held it out, not like a demand, not like a challenge, but like an answer waiting to be read. For a heartbeat, no one moved, the air between them thickening, the soft clink of silverware inside fading into something distant, as if the entire room had leaned closer without realizing it. Daniel hesitated just long enough to reveal that this moment was no longer routine, then reached out and took the card, his thumb brushing across its surface as his eyes dropped to read. And in that exact second, before his expression had time to change, before the meaning fully registered, the balance of the room tilted in a way no one could yet name. Daniel's eyes moved across the surface of the card once, then again, slower the second time, as if his mind needed an extra second to align what he was reading with what he was seeing, and the practiced composure he carried like a uniform began to loosen at the edges. The subtle gold lettering caught the chandelier light, and for a brief moment, the reflection made it difficult to ignore. Carter Dining Group, founder and chief executive officer, Naomi Carter, the words sitting there with quiet authority, not loud, not decorative, just undeniable. His fingers tightened slightly around the card, and his breath paused halfway through as the weight of the moment settled in, not all at once, but in layers, each one heavier than the last. Emily leaned in just enough to glance at it, her curiosity overriding her confidence, and the shift in her expression was immediate, a flicker of confusion first, then disbelief, then something closer to realization that she did not yet want to accept. The room responded before either of them spoke, a ripple moving through the tables as the energy changed, subtle but unmistakable, conversations thinning into silence, a chair scraping lightly against the floor as someone adjusted their seat to see better, a glass set down with more care than before. Daniel looked up at Naomi, really looked this time, not at her coat or her shoes, not at the surface details he had relied on just moments earlier, but at her presence, the steadiness in her posture, the calm in her eyes that had not wavered once since she arrived. Miss Carter, he said, the name coming out slower than intended, his voice catching just enough to reveal that this was no longer routine, I was not aware that you were visiting this location tonight. The sentence careful, respectful, but edged with something else, something like concern. Naomi held his gaze, not correcting him, not filling the silence, allowing the weight of his own words to settle between them. Emily straightened beside him, her shoulders pulling back as if posture alone could restore control. There must be some kind of mistake, she said quickly, her tone tightening, searching for something to hold on to. We follow strict reservation protocols, and if the system does not show. She stopped, the sentence trailing off as Daniel's hand lifted slightly, not to silence her forcefully, but enough to signal that the situation had moved beyond her control. The tablet in her hands suddenly felt heavier, her grip adjusting unconsciously as the certainty she had leaned on began to slip. Naomi spoke then, her voice still even, still measured. The system is not the issue, she said, her words landing with quiet precision. The way it is used is, and the statement did not accuse, did not raise in volume, but it carried a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but visible in the slight rise and fall of his shoulders, and he glanced toward the dining room, seeing it now from a different angle, not just as a manager maintaining flow, but as someone realizing that every interaction, every decision, had been observed, evaluated, understood. A server near the bar lowered his gaze, suddenly aware of the moment he had been watching, while a couple at the nearest table exchanged a look that needed no words. The air shifted again, heavier now, not with tension alone, but with recognition. Daniel returned his attention to Naomi, the card still in his hand, and for a brief second, there was no script left to follow, no polished line ready to smooth this over. Only the reality of what had just unfolded and the understanding that what came next would define more than just this evening. Naomi remained still, her expression unchanged, not waiting for an apology, not demanding one, simply present, as if giving the space for something honest to finally take shape. The silence stretched just a fraction too long, the kind that made every small sound feel louder, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant clink of glass, the soft shuffle of a server adjusting a tray. Daniel finally shifted his weight, stepping slightly to the side, no longer blocking the entrance but not yet inviting her in, caught between what had already happened and what he knew should happen next. "Miss Carter," he began again, more carefully this time, his voice lower, stripped of the polished confidence he had worn earlier. "Please allow us to correct this situation." And the words were sincere, but they arrived after the moment that had already defined everything. Naomi's gaze remained steady, not cold, not warm, simply present, as if measuring the space between intention and action. Emily stood frozen beside the podium, her tablet now held closer to her chest, her earlier certainty replaced by a tight stillness, her eyes flicking between Daniel and Naomi, searching for direction that no longer came easily. "We can prepare a table immediately," Daniel continued, gesturing lightly toward the dining room where a few guests now pretended not to watch, though their attention lingered in every slowed movement, every delayed sip. Naomi did not move, her hand still relaxed at her side, her posture unchanged, and for a moment it seemed as if the offer had not reached her at all. Then she spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying through the stillness with clarity that did not need volume. "You had a table for me earlier," she said, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. The words settled heavily, and Daniel's expression tightened, not in defense, but in recognition, as if the truth of it left no room for explanation. Emily swallowed, her shoulders drawing in slightly, the edges of her composure beginning to fray. "I did not realize," she started, but the sentence faltered, incomplete, because realization was not the point. Naomi turned her gaze toward her, not harsh, not condemning, but direct enough that Emily could not look away. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something about assumptions, about decisions made in seconds that carried consequences far beyond the moment. "What you realized," Naomi said softly, "came after you decided." And the distinction hung there, precise, undeniable. A man at a nearby table shifted in his seat, his napkin slipping slightly as he adjusted it. the small movement echoing louder than it should have in the quiet. Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand lowering from its gesture, the invitation still there, but no longer the focus. And he glanced toward the entrance behind Naomi, where the city lights stretched down the block, steady, indifferent. This location is meant to reflect our standards, he said, more to himself than to her, as if hearing the words out loud revealed something he had not fully faced before. Naomi followed his gaze for a brief second, then returned it to him. Standards are not written on walls, she replied, her tone even. They are practiced in moments like this, and the simplicity of it left no space to hide. Emily's grip on the tablet loosened slightly, her fingers adjusting as if trying to hold onto something solid. But there was nothing left to anchor to accept the truth unfolding in front of her. Daniel nodded once, slowly. The motion small but deliberate, and for the first time since he approached, he did not try to resolve the situation quickly, did not rush to restore the flow, instead allowing the pause to remain, to be felt, to be understood. Naomi stood there, calm, unshaken, not demanding anything, not needing to, because the moment itself had already revealed everything that needed to be seen, and the room, once filled with quiet observation, now held something heavier, something closer to awareness, as if everyone present had just witnessed more than a simple misunderstanding, and knew, even without words, that what happened next would not be about a table at all. The air did not move, not really, but something inside it shifted, something heavier than silence, and Daniel felt it settle across the room like a weight he could not redirect. He looked down at the card again, as if confirming it had not changed in the last few seconds, then back at Naomi, and for the first time since he had taken his role at this location, he did not have a response ready, not one that could smooth this over or return things to normal. "You are right," he said finally, the words quiet, unguarded, and different from anything he had said before, because they were not part of a script, they were an admission. Emily's head turned toward him sharply, the shift immediate, as if she had not expected him to step away from the version of events she had built, her lips parting slightly, then pressing together again as she realized there was nothing she could say that would restore what had already been revealed. Naomi watched him, not with approval, not with judgment, simply observing, as if the truth mattered more than how it arrived. Daniel straightened, not in defense, but in resolve, and turned slightly toward the dining room, his voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest tables without raising it. "This is not how we operate," he said, and the statement was not loud, but it was clear, and it belonged to the space now. A server near the aisle paused completely, her tray balanced mid-step, while a man at a corner table lowered his fork slowly, his attention no longer hidden. Emily shifted her weight, the subtle movement revealing her discomfort, her confidence no longer anchored, her earlier certainty replaced by something unsettled, something uncertain. "I followed the system," she said quietly, her voice smaller now, searching for ground. "I did what I was trained to do." And the sentence lingered, not as a defense, but as a reflection of something deeper, something embedded. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in understanding. "Then the training is incomplete," she replied, her tone even, not harsh, but firm enough to carry meaning beyond the moment. Daniel exhaled slowly, the truth of that settling in, and he nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not erase what had happened, but recognized it. He handed the card back to Naomi with both hands, a gesture of respect that came instinctively now, not rehearsed, not instructed, simply appropriate. "This will be addressed," he said, and there was no urgency in his voice, no attempt to rush past it, only a quiet commitment that carried more weight than anything louder could have. Naomi took the card, her fingers steady, and for a brief moment, her eyes moved across the room again, taking in the details one more time, not as a guest, but as someone responsible for what this place represented: the lighting, the spacing, the service, the unspoken hierarchy that had just revealed itself in a single interaction. Emily looked down at her tablet, the screen still open, the empty reservation list reflecting back at her, and for the first time, it did not feel like a tool of certainty, but a mirror of something flawed. The room held its breath again, not in tension, but in anticipation, as if everyone present understood that the moment had not ended. It had only shifted, and whatever came next would not simply resolve the situation, it would define it. Naomi remained still, her presence unchanged, and in that stillness, there was something undeniable, something that did not need to be announced or proven, because it had already been seen, and the quiet that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of recognition, the kind that does not disappear once it arrives. No one spoke for a few seconds, not because they did not have anything to say, but because the moment had moved past words and into something quieter, something that asked to be felt before it could be answered. Naomi shifted her gaze once more across the dining room, slower this time, noticing details that most people would never see. The slight hesitation in a server's step when approaching certain tables, the way some guests were greeted with warmth while others received efficiency, the invisible lines that separated experience from expectation. She took a small step forward, not into the restaurant, but just enough to stand fully in the doorway, where the warm light met the cooler air from outside, and in that threshold, she paused. Daniel watched her closely, not interrupting, not guiding, simply allowing space, his earlier urgency replaced by something more attentive, more aware. Emily remained beside the podium, her posture still, but her expression no longer guarded. Her eyes lowered for a brief moment before lifting again, as if she were seeing the same room differently now. Naomi spoke again, her voice soft, but clear enough to carry without effort. When I opened my first place, it was 12 tables and 1 borrowed stove, she said, her words not directed at anyone in particular, yet reaching everyone within earshot. We did not have systems, we did not have policies, we only had people, and the only thing that mattered was how each person felt when they walked through the door. The memory sat gently in the air, contrasting with the polished structure around them. A server near the back shifted her stance, listening without meaning to, while a man at the bar lowered his glass slightly, his attention fully drawn now. Naomi continued, "Growth changes things. It adds layers, it adds distance, and sometimes it replaces intention with procedure." She glanced briefly at Emily, not accusing, but including her in the understanding. But the foundation should never disappear. The statement settled with a quiet weight, not heavy, but undeniable. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment as if tracing back through every decision made in the last hour, the last day, the last year, searching for where that distance had begun. Emily's fingers loosened around the tablet, the tension in her grip easing as something shifted internally, something less defensive, more reflective. Naomi took another small breath, the kind that steadies rather than releases, and her eyes moved once more across the room, not with disappointment, but with clarity. "Tonight was not about a table," she said, her voice steady. "It was about a moment, and moments are where people decide who belongs and who does not." The words were simple, but they carried through the space with precision, touching something deeper than the situation itself. A quiet stillness followed, not forced, not uncomfortable, but intentional, as if the room itself was absorbing what had been said. Daniel stepped slightly closer, not to lead, but to stand beside the moment rather than in front of it, his presence no longer about control, but about acknowledgement. Emily remained where she was, but her posture softened, her shoulders lowering just enough to signal a shift that no one needed explained. Naomi remained in the doorway, balanced between inside and outside, between what had happened and what could still change. And in that space, she did not rush forward. She did not turn away. She simply stood, allowing the silence to complete what words had begun, because sometimes the most important part of a moment is not what is said, but what is finally understood. Daniel's voice did not rise, but when he spoke again, it carried differently, not as a manager trying to fix a situation, but as someone who had finally understood the weight of it. "Miss Carter," he said, slower now, each word placed with care. "This location was scheduled for a full internal review next quarter." He paused, just briefly, then added, "But I believe that timeline no longer applies." And the meaning behind it settled immediately, not just with Naomi, but across the room, where every listener could feel that something larger than a single evening had just shifted. Emily's head lifted slightly, her eyes widening just enough to register what he was saying, the implication unfolding in real time, not as punishment, but as consequence. Naomi remained still, her expression unchanged, but her attention sharpened, as if she had been waiting not for an apology, but for this exact moment of clarity. Daniel continued, "You did not come here expecting to be recognized, and that is exactly why this matters." His gaze moved briefly across the dining room, acknowledging the space as a whole, because every guest who walks through that door should receive the same respect, whether we know their name or not. The statement was simple, but it carried the authority of someone who understood that it was no longer optional. A quiet murmur passed through the nearest tables, not loud, but present, like the sound of something being recalibrated. Emily shifted her stance, her shoulders lowering further, the tension in her posture giving way to something more honest, more uncertain. "I thought I was maintaining standards," she said quietly, not defensive anymore, just reflective. "I did not realize I was deciding who met them." The admission was small, but it landed with more impact than anything she had said before. Naomi looked at her for a moment, really looked, and there was no anger there, only recognition of the lesson taking shape. "Standards are not about exclusion," Naomi said, her voice calm. "They are about consistency." And the distinction settled into the space like a line drawn clearly for the first time. Daniel nodded once, then turned slightly toward the interior, signaling subtly to the staff without raising his voice, without disrupting the atmosphere. But the shift was immediate. A server straightened, another adjusted their pace, small changes that reflected a larger awareness. Naomi took a single step forward, crossing the threshold now, not as a guest being admitted, but as someone choosing to enter after understanding the full picture, her heels soft against the polished floor, the sound barely audible, but somehow marking the moment. The room adjusted around her, not dramatically, not suddenly, but perceptibly, the energy shifting from observation to presence, from curiosity to respect. Daniel stepped aside completely this time, no longer positioned as a barrier, but as someone making space. "Your table is ready," he said. But the words felt different now. Not an offer, not a correction, but an acknowledgement. Naomi paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze moving once more across the room, not searching, not evaluating, simply taking in what had changed and what still needed to. And in that pause, the moment completed itself, not with a dramatic turn, but with a quiet understanding that what had been revealed could not be unseen, and what would follow would not return things to the way they were, but move them toward what they should have been all along. Emily did not move when Naomi stepped past her, not immediately, her hand still resting against the edge of the podium as if it were the only stable thing left in the room, her breath shallow, controlled, but no longer certain. She watched Naomi walk inside, not with the distant judgment she had carried earlier, but with a quiet awareness that felt unfamiliar, heavier, something that lingered in her chest. "Miss Carter," she said, the words coming out softer than she intended, not loud enough to stop her, but enough to be heard. Naomi paused, just slightly, turning her head without fully turning her body, giving space for the moment without giving it control. Emily stepped forward then, one small step, her posture no longer rigid, her shoulders no longer lifted in practiced confidence. "I am sorry," she said, and this time the words did not sound rehearsed, did not carry the polish of customer service. They were simple, direct, and for the first time, real. The room listened again, but differently now, not waiting for a twist, not expecting a reaction, just witnessing something quieter unfold. Naomi looked at her, not measuring, not evaluating, simply present, and for a brief second, there was no distance between them, no role, no title, just two people standing in the same moment. "I understand," Naomi replied, her voice calm, not dismissive, not indulgent, just clear. "But understanding is where it begins, not where it ends." The sentence settled gently, but it carried direction, something forward-looking rather than final. Emily nodded, a small movement, but one that held more weight than anything she had done earlier, her grip loosening from the podium completely now, her hands resting at her sides, unguarded. Daniel watched the exchange without interruption, his presence quieter than before, allowing the moment to belong to them rather than to management or control. Naomi turned back toward the dining room, continuing her steps forward, her pace unhurried, deliberate, and as she moved, the space adjusted around her, not in grand gestures, but in small, meaningful ones, a server stepping slightly closer to offer assistance, a chair pulled out with care, a glass of water placed gently on the table without being asked. She reached the table that had been prepared, the setting precise, the silverware aligned, the candle casting a soft, steady glow, and for a moment, she simply stood there, looking at it, not with satisfaction, not with disappointment, but with quiet reflection. Emily remained near the entrance, watching, not with fear now, but with something closer to resolve, as if the moment had not ended for her, but had just begun in a different way. Daniel stepped back into his role, but not as it had been before, his posture more grounded, his attention more present, as he moved through the room, not overseeing, but observing with new awareness. Naomi finally took her seat, the chair sliding softly against the floor, the sound blending into the gentle rhythm of the restaurant returning, but not quite the same as before. She placed her hands lightly on the table, the candlelight reflecting in her eyes, steady, thoughtful, and in that stillness, there was no need for more words, because what had been said, what had been seen, and what had been understood had already begun to reshape everything around her, not loudly, not instantly, but undeniably, in the quiet way that real change always begins. The restaurant slowly found its rhythm again, but it was not the same rhythm as before. Something in it had softened, shifted, as if every movement now carried a little more awareness than it had just minutes earlier. Naomi sat quietly at her table, the soft glow of the candle reflecting off the polished surface, her hands resting lightly beside the neatly folded napkin, her posture relaxed but grounded, not as someone who had just proven a point, but as someone who had simply revealed a truth. Across the room, Daniel moved with a different kind of focus, no longer just overseeing operations, but watching interactions, noticing the pauses, the tone, the details that once blended into routine. A server approached Naomi with a glass of water, placing it gently, not rushed, not overly careful, just present, and for a moment, their eyes met, a brief exchange that required no words, only acknowledgement. Near the entrance, Emily remained at her station, but she stood differently now, her shoulders no longer lifted in automatic defense, her gaze more attentive, more open, as each new guest arrived. When a couple stepped through the door, she greeted them with the same warmth she had given others before, but this time there was no calculation behind it, no silent evaluation, just a simple, consistent welcome. The difference was subtle, but it was real. Naomi lifted the menu, her eyes scanning it briefly before setting it back down, not because she did not know what was on it, but because the moment was no longer about the meal. She looked around once more, not searching for flaws, not measuring performance, but observing the shift taking root, small, quiet, but present. The low murmur of conversation returned, the soft clink of silverware, the gentle movement of staff weaving between tables. And yet beneath it all, there was something else, something steadier, something that had not been there before. Daniel paused near the center of the room, his gaze moving from table to table, then, briefly toward Naomi, not seeking approval, not expecting acknowledgement, but understanding the responsibility that now sat more clearly in his hands. Emily glanced up once, catching Naomi's presence from across the room, and for a second, she held that awareness, not with discomfort, but with intention, as if reminding herself of what this moment meant moving forward, outside, beyond the glass doors. The city continued as it always did, cars passing, lights shifting, people moving without knowing what had taken place inside. But within these walls, something had been realigned. Naomi reached for her glass, taking a small sip of water, the simple action grounding the moment back into something ordinary, and perhaps that was the point. That respect should not require a revelation, that dignity should not depend on recognition. She set the glass down softly, the sound barely noticeable, and allowed the quiet to settle around her, not empty, but complete. No announcement followed, no dramatic conclusion, only the steady continuation of a place learning, in real time, what it meant to live up to its own name. And as the candle flickered gently in front of her, Naomi did not smile, did not nod. She simply sat, breathing evenly, knowing that the most important part of the night was not what had changed in the moment, but what would remain changed long after it ended.